Ed McMahon's voice trembled. "Do you remember that night, Johnny?" he said. And Johnny Carson bowed his head, tried to hide the tears, but Ed walked over and placed his hand on his shoulder. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. March 1979. Studio 6B at NBC in Burbank. Another Thursday night. Another monologue. Another 300 people in the audience expecting laughs and celebrity guests, and the comfortable rhythm of America's favorite late-night show. Johnny was at his desk doing what he'd done thousands of times before, reading jokes from his blue cue cards, timing his delivery perfectly, making it all look effortless. Ed McMahon sat in his usual spot beside the desk, providing the thunderous laughter and enthusiastic "yes" responses that had become his trademark. The monologue was going well. Jokes about politics. Jokes about Hollywood. The audience was eating it up. Doc Severinsen and the band were ready with the bumper music. Everything was exactly as it should be. Until Ed said something he wasn't supposed to say. Johnny had just finished a joke about the gas crisis. The audience was laughing. He was reaching for the next cue card. And Ed, perhaps lost in a memory triggered by something in that joke, spoke quietly, almost to himself, but the desk microphone caught every word. "That reminds me of that night. In Nebraska. Do you remember, Johnny?" Johnny's hand froze halfway to the cue cards. His smile vanished. The entire studio felt the shift, the way a room changes when someone mentions the one thing everyone has silently agreed never to discuss. The audience's laughter died away into uncertain silence. Johnny looked at Ed. His oldest friend. His partner for nearly 20 years. The man who knew all the stories Johnny had carefully locked away. "Ed," Johnny said quietly, a warning in his voice. "Don't." But Ed wasn't looking at the audience, or the cameras. He was looking at his friend, and in his eyes was something that said it's time. Ed's voice trembled as he leaned toward Johnny, and the entire studio froze. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in Nebraska. Specifically, in a hospital in North Platte, on a winter night in 1962. Johnny Carson wasn't always Johnny Carson, king of late-night television. In 1962, he was hosting a daytime game show called Who Do You Trust?, doing well but not yet a household name. He was 36 years old, recently divorced from his first wife, trying to rebuild his life and career in New York City. His parents still lived in Norfolk, Nebraska, where Johnny had grown up. His father, Homer "Kit" Carson, ran a power company. His mother, Ruth, was a formidable woman with exacting standards and little patience for weakness, the kind of mother who made sure her sons knew that displays of emotion were signs of failure. Johnny rarely talked about his childhood. When interviewers asked, he'd deflect with a joke. The relationship with his mother was complicated, cold, difficult. But his younger brother, Dick Carson, had stayed close to the family, still living in Nebraska, still trying to make their mother proud. Dick wanted to be in television too. He'd worked as a director on local stations, dreaming of bigger opportunities. Johnny had helped where he could, making introductions, offering advice. They weren't particularly close. The 8-year age gap and their mother's tendency to pit them against each other had seen to that, but they were brothers. On February 7, 1962, Johnny got a phone call at his New York apartment. His sister-in-law's voice, barely coherent through sobs. There had been an accident. Dick's car had gone off an icy road near North Platte. He was in the hospital. It didn't look good. Johnny caught the first flight to Omaha, then drove through the night to North Platte Regional Hospital. He arrived at 3 a.m. to find his parents in the waiting room, his father silent and gray, his mother rigid with that iron control she'd always insisted upon. "The doctors say he won't make it through the night," his mother said, her voice flat and motionless. "You should prepare yourself." Johnny had gone into Dick's hospital room alone. His brother was unconscious, hooked to machines, his face bruised and swollen from the impact. Johnny had sat beside the bed and, for the first time in his adult life, had completely broken down. He'd cried. Sobbed, actually. The kind of crying he'd learned as a child was unacceptable. The kind his mother had trained out of him with cold disapproval and cutting remarks. And his mother had walked into the room and seen him. "Pull yourself together," she'd said, her voice sharp as a slap. "This is unseemly. You're embarrassing yourself." "He's my brother," Johnny had managed through tears. "He's dying. Which is why you need to be strong. Tears won't help him. They won't help anyone. They're self-indulgent." Johnny had looked at his mother, this woman who had never hugged him as a child, who had never said she was proud of him, who viewed emotion as weakness, and something inside him had crystallized into ice. He'd wiped his face, composed himself, put the mask back on, and he'd never taken it off again. Dick Carson died 4 hours later without regaining consciousness. He was 20 years old. At the funeral, Johnny had delivered a eulogy that was eloquent, poised, perfectly controlled. No tears. No visible grief. Everyone had commented on how well he was handling it. Only Ed McMahon had known the truth. Ed had flown out for the funeral, not because it was expected, but because he'd become close to Johnny during their years working together. He'd seen Johnny in the hotel room after the service, sitting alone in the dark, still wearing his funeral suit, staring at nothing. "You can let it out," Ed had said quietly. "It's just me here. There's nothing to let out," Johnny had replied, his voice hollow. "I'm fine. Johnny," I said, "I'm fine." Then, after a long pause, "My mother was right. Tears are self-indulgent. They don't change anything. Dick is gone and crying won't bring him back. So what's the point?" Ed had stayed with him that night, not talking, just present. And he'd watched Johnny build a wall around that grief so high and so strong that 17 years later, it was still standing. Until tonight. March 1979. When Ed McMahon, perhaps without fully realizing what he was doing, had mentioned that night in Nebraska. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. The Tonight Show studio was completely silent. 300 people holding their breath. The cameras still rolling because the control room didn't know whether to cut away or keep recording this moment that had shattered the usual format. Johnny was staring at Ed, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "Ed," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please don't do this." Ed stood up from his chair beside the desk. He walked over to where Johnny sat. And he did something he'd never done in nearly 20 years of The Tonight Show. He placed his hand on Johnny's shoulder. "Johnny," Ed said, his own voice thick with emotion. "It's been 17 years. And in all that time, you've never talked about your brother. Not once. Not on this show, not in interviews, not even with me except for that one night." Johnny's jaw worked. He was fighting it. Fighting hard. The cameras caught every second of it. The legendary composure beginning to crack, the wall he'd built starting to crumble. "America knows you as the man who makes them laugh every night," Ed continued, his hand still firm on Johnny's shoulder. "But they don't know about the brother you lost. About the grief you've carried. About the night your mother told you that crying was weakness." A sound escaped Johnny's throat, not quite a word, not quite a sob. His head bowed forward. His hand came up to cover his eyes. "She was wrong, Johnny," Ed said softly. "Your mother was wrong. Tears aren't weakness. They're human. And you're allowed to be human." Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. Johnny Carson cried. On camera. In front of 300 studio audience members. In front of millions watching at home. The man who had built a career on perfect control, who had never let anyone see behind the mask, who had turned emotional armor into an art form, he broke. His shoulders shook. Tears ran down his face. He didn't try to hide them or wipe them away. He just let them fall while Ed stood beside him, hand on his shoulder, bearing witness to grief that had waited 17 years to be acknowledged. The studio remained absolutely silent. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seats. Even Doc Severinsen and the band seemed frozen, instruments lowered, watching their friend finally release what he'd held so long. Ed looked directly at camera one. "Folks, I'm going to tell you something that Johnny won't tell you himself. In 1962, Johnny lost his younger brother Dick in a car accident. Dick was 28 years old. He wanted to work in television just like his big brother. And on the night he died, Johnny's mother told him that crying was unseemly. That tears were self-indulgent. That he needed to pull himself together." Ed's own voice cracked. His eyes were wet. So Johnny did. He pulled himself together. He put on a mask and he never took it off. For 17 years, he's made America laugh while carrying grief he was never allowed to express. And I think it's time America knew. I think it's time Johnny knew that it's okay. That he doesn't have to be strong every single night. That we love him not because he's perfect, but because he's real. Johnny finally lifted his head. His face was wet with tears, his eyes red, his usual composure completely gone. He looked at Ed with an expression of such raw gratitude and vulnerability that it broke hearts across America. "I miss him," Johnny said, his voice hoarse. "I still miss him. Every day." "I know you do," Ed said gently. "And I never got to say goodbye. He died without knowing that I'd—" Johnny stopped, unable to finish. "He knew," Ed said firmly. "Brothers know. Trust me. He knew." But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. Johnny reached into his desk drawer. The same drawer where he kept his blue cue cards, his pens, the small personal items that lived within arm's reach during every show. He pulled out a photograph, old, creased, the edges worn from being handled. He held it up toward the camera. The image of two boys, maybe 8 and 16 years old, standing in front of a house in Nebraska. The younger boy was grinning widely, looking up at his big brother with obvious admiration. The older boy had his arm around the younger one's shoulders. "This is Dick," Johnny said, his voice steadier now but still thick with emotion. "This is my brother. I've kept this picture in my desk since the first day I started hosting this show. Every night for 17 years, it's been right here. And I've never told anyone why." He looked at the photograph for a long moment. "I thought if I didn't talk about it, if I didn't let myself feel it, then maybe it wouldn't hurt so much. My mother taught me that. Bury it. Move on. Tears are weakness." Johnny looked directly into the camera, his tear-streaked face filling the screen. But Ed's right. She was wrong. Tears aren't weakness. Grief isn't self-indulgent. Missing someone you loved isn't unseemly. It's just love that has nowhere to go. The studio erupted. Not in applause, not yet. But in that collective sound of 300 people releasing the breath they'd been holding, of 300 people crying along with the man who'd made them laugh for so many years. Ed squeezed Johnny's shoulder one more time, then slowly returned to his chair. Doc Severinsen raised his hand and the band began to play, softly, gently, a melody so quiet it was almost a whisper. Johnny carefully placed the photograph on his desk where the cameras could still see it. Where America could see Dick Carson's smiling face. Where he would remain visible for the rest of the show, no longer hidden in a drawer, no longer a secret grief, but acknowledged. Honored. Remembered. "We'll be right back," Johnny said quietly, and the show went to commercial. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. During the commercial break, Johnny stood up and embraced Ed McMahon. A real hug, not the casual backslaps of show business but the embrace of brothers who'd walked through fire together. "Thank you," Johnny whispered. "I needed that." "I know," Ed said simply. When they came back from commercial, Johnny kept the photograph on his desk. Visible. Present. For the rest of the show, Dick Carson smiled out at millions of viewers, no longer hidden, no longer a secret. The next day, Johnny received 17,000 letters. People sharing their own hidden grief. Their own losses they'd been told to bury. Their own brothers, sisters, parents, children they still missed every single day. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Johnny kept that photograph on his desk for every show after that night. When he retired in 1992, he took it with him. When he died in 2005, it was found in his bedroom, still creased, still worn from decades of being held. Ed McMahon spoke at Johnny's funeral. He told that story about the night in Nebraska. About the mother who said tears were weakness. About the brother who finally allowed himself to grieve. Johnny taught America to laugh, Ed said. But that night in 1979, he taught us something more important. He taught us that it's okay to cry. The photograph is now in the Smithsonian. Below it, a small plaque. Dick Carson, 1934 to 1962. Loved by his brother.